In this video, we'll be looking at what I call alignment and playing angle and how those affect pitch and tone. Alignment simply means lining up our opening or airstream with the sharp edge or utaguchi in order to make a sound. And playing angle is the angle that we hold the shakuhachi at, which determines the distance from our lips to the edge. For example, if I create a lot of distance between my lips and the edge, I'll have to use more power from my air, but in turn, I'll make a very loud, robust sound that's typical for modern jiari shakuhachi playing, and it sounds a bit like this. Now we could play it closer to the blowing edge. We won't be able to make as much of a loud sound because we'll have to use less power from our air, but we'll get a more subdued kind of classical sound that's typical for antique jiari and jinashi shakuhachi, and it sounds a bit like this. Now, this is especially true for most antique jinashi shakuhachi, like this one from the Edo period. Now, during that time, there were no jiari type shakuhachi because they hadn't been invented yet. And like I said, many of these antiques have to be played in a classical, or what I'm calling a classical position, closer to the edge with a more gentle airstream, like this. So before we get into these particular details, we're first simply going to look at how to align this edge with our airstream so that you can make a sound. I recommend the beginners or anybody who's struggling to get a sound on their shakuhachi hold the flute just below the blowing edge with the top hand, or the hand that would cover the top holes. Put that just below the face of the edge, that flat face, and then put your bottom hand in position on the bottom two holes. That way we can use this top hand to make very precise and minute adjustments that are often necessary to align the edge with our air. So let's take a closer look at that. First, we're going to look at horizontal alignment. So basically, we just want to align the edge with where our opening might be falling along our lips. Now, if you have a pronounced point at the top of your top lip, this is called a tubercle, you might find that you are getting an opening on both sides of this point, and you're going to want to try to just have one opening either to the right or to the left of that point in your lip. So if you play with right hand on bottom, it could be advantageous for you to try to make that opening to the right side, your right side of that point in your lip. And that could be useful for playing longer shakuhachi. It could end up being a bit more ergonomic. But if it happens to just want to fall to the left side of that point, then that's fine too. As you can see, I don't have one of those pronounced points in my top lip or tubercle of the top lip. But with that said, my embouchure still falls a little bit to my right. So when I play shakuhachi, you can see that I have to align the edge horizontally a little bit to my right side. If I were to put it on my left side, you can hear I wouldn't get a sound. So this is pretty important. So make sure that you have it lined up horizontally for where your opening is on your lips. Now we're ready to look at vertical alignment. So again, we're going to hold the shakuhachi just below that flat face of the edge. So we can use this hand to make small adjustments in order to align it with our airstream. As you can see on my chin, I have a ridge. So the shakuhachi can't go lower, it has to rest on that. Your chin might be different. So we're just trying to make these little adjustments that might be necessary in order to line that up and make a sound. Now a lot of people, as I said, will start out playing shakuhachi with a really big opening, one that's really just too big. And it makes for a kind of a windy, turbulent sound. And it's easier to hit the edge with such a big airstream. And as people make the opening more ideal or smaller, whether that's intentionally or just through practice, they inevitably will run into alignment issues where their opening will sort of make the airstream smaller and it'll be harder to hit that edge and they might miss it and they can't make a sound. So many times over, beginners will try to make it smaller, they'll struggle to get a sound, and then whether they know it or not, their lip opening will just open up again. So it'll look something like this. They'll make a nice small opening. They'll fail to make a sound, and then it'll open back up. So we want to try to not do this. We want to try to keep this on the smaller side and use this top hand to make subtle adjustments to realign it like this. So no matter what approach we're taking, whether that be sort of a smiling embouchure or one that might be more like this, the same principle applies. We're just trying to line it up with wherever our opening might be. So as we saw, using the hand up top can really help us to make those minute adjustments that might be necessary in order to align that edge with our airstream and get a sound. Using a mirror during this process is very useful. It's common for students to also unknowingly rotate the shakuhachi in their hands, usually towards their bottom hand side. So right hand on bottom towards their right side, like this. And of course, enough rotation will negatively affect the tone. So let's take a closer look. Notice the point at which the sound starts to suffer as I rotate it. And if I can maneuver around my tripod, I'll give you a more front view. So too much rotation will obviously make the tone suffer. A little bit usually doesn't affect it so much. So just try to be mindful if you happen to be rotating the shakuhachi. When we try to play shakuhachi of different outer diameters or sizes, we can run into a lot of difficulties trying to line up the edge. And one of those reasons, which I'll show you, is the need to adjust how open the mouth is or how low you place your jaw. Now this is more important if you have the sort of bone or ridge that I mentioned, where the shakuhachi can't really go any lower on your chin. So with people that don't have this, who have maybe a flatter chin, they might be able to position the shakuhachi or different shakuhachi more easily on their chin. So if you have this bone, or if you just happen to be attempting to play a rather large shakuhachi, you might have to adjust this positioning. So on this much more narrow shakuhachi, you can see that the space between my teeth is pretty minimal, and I'm not really having to do anything dramatic with my jaw. If I switch to a large shakuhachi, if I attempt that same positioning, my air just goes into the flute. It's not lining up with the edge. And because I can't slide this any lower on my particular chin, I have to drop my jaw to line it up with my opening. As you can see, if I put the smaller shakuhachi on my face in this position, my air completely misses and goes over the shakuhachi entirely. So when trying to play shakuhachi that have different outer diameters, you might have to make these kind of adjustments in order to line it up to get a sound. Focusing on improving our power will often improve the pitch and the tone. Now, as I mentioned, many beginners start out with a weaker breath, and this will result in a flatter pitch. And quite a few make the mistake of trying to correct for this flatter pitch by doing this. And as we mentioned earlier, that creates more space between the lips and the edge. And when we do this, we actually need more power from our air to produce a solid tone. So what happens for many beginners that have a weaker breath is that they'll look at a tuner, they'll see that they're flat, and they'll try to correct for this by doing that, by creating more space, lowering the shakuhachi like this, and the tone greatly suffers. It'll break up and become airy, as you just heard. Now, another danger of doing this is that we can get into the habit of moving the shakuhachi to correct for various pitch sort of discrepancies, and we don't want to do that. We want to keep the shakuhachi in our hands and arms at a steady angle, and we get different pitches like meri, flatter pitches, by lowering our head or bringing our lips closer to the edge by lowering our head. What we don't want to do is we don't want to play the natural or basic notes just opening one after the other. We don't want to play these and have our head moving around for all the various notes. So back to this issue of sort of trying to correct for that flatter pitch that's produced as a result of having a weaker airstream at first. So by doing this, we also will run the risk of creating so much space that no matter how much we try, we actually cannot make a solid tone. So there's a point at which the distance is too great and there's no amount of skill that will improve the tone. And that'll look and sound something like this. So I'm going to start out with a good tone, and I'm going to move through a range and continue to produce a good tone, and then I'll reach a point where there's nothing I can do to make a good tone. So right about there, you could hear the tone broke up, and I couldn't recover it. So there was a certain range where I could make a good tone, and then at a certain point it was just too far away. So a beginner with a weaker airstream can really run the risk, when they try to correct the pitch in this way, of creating so much space that they can never improve. And this is incredibly important because we can practice and practice and struggle, and we can wonder why our tone isn't improving and why just the sound is very airy and diffused. And that could very well be because we've actually created too much space. So what I recommend for most of my students, and especially if they are starting out with a weaker breath, which is most common, is to focus on just making a solid tone. I like to say, let the tone be your guide. What will often happen is that students just naturally start to develop more power. And as we develop more power, we naturally tend to make more space to allow for that power. So what I mean by that is that if we try to use too much power and we're too close, it'll overwhelm the shakuhachi, and it might sound something like this. So you hear it's kind of bubbling. The power is sort of overflowing, and the sound is bubbling and turbulent in a different sort of way. It's a solid tone, but it's sort of fighting to break free. And it can often jump into the higher sounds like kan, or even a higher sound than that. And this is something that most people just naturally correct for without even realizing it. They'll make more space, which will allow for their newfound power to really express itself. And it will sound something like this. So we'll go from being kind of congested to opening up and having the ability to let that power sort of express a loud and robust tone. And eventually we might decide that we prefer to play a bit closer to the edge with a bit more of a gentle sort of airstream to achieve maybe more of that classical sound or a gentler sound. Or we might prefer to play with a more robust kind of modern sound. And of course, if we're fortunate enough to be able to develop both of these, or the ability to play in any number of distances from the edge, we might choose to play a certain way on a particular shakuhachi, or like this Edo period shakuhachi, antique shakuhachi, we might have to play in a more subdued kind of way. So as you can see, these sort of aesthetical choices, it's very much a matter of taste. And there's also some practical or objective reasons that we might find that we have to play a certain way. So when possible, I encourage everybody, to explore. Of course, it can be difficult, if we have to try to purchase, various instruments, it can become quite expensive. So my general advice is to look at what your teacher does, the flutes your teacher plays. You typically will select a teacher whose sound that you prefer, and just see what kind of instruments do they play, what angle do they play at, and work towards that. So if they play modern jiari and they play in a very loud, robust way, realize that that is going to take you time to develop towards, because you're going to need a lot of power. And on your way there to that goal, it's perfectly fine to be closer to the edge at first, to be flatter, and just know that as you develop your power and as you grow, you'll be able to make your way towards that goal.